Thanks, Brock, for hosting this. And thanks, Scrum Alliance, for supporting this community, this global community. So I'm pleased to share on this topic with you, serving the organization, and in a sense, hopefully we'll provide some new thinking to some of you here, and maybe confirm a lot of thinking. I think we've probably got a very good group here that has a lot of experience, and so I want to draw upon that through this. So in a sense, I think many of you know me and essentially my background. I won't spend too much time on this. Essentially, I've been in this space for quite a while, and connected to the Scrum Alliance in a number of different ways, including creating the Certified Enterprise Coaching Program back in 2007, and helping create the Certified Agile Leadership Journey, Agile Leadership, the CAL program in the Scrum Alliance back in 2016, as well as being on the board of directors. So you've got my contact information there. Feel free to reach out on that. I'll actually go through this fairly quickly, since I know we have a lot of very strong people here. I'm not going to try to bore you too much, and I want it to be as interactive as possible. And I know this is challenging via hundreds of people on Zoom, but we'll try to do this best possible. So I do encourage you, and I saw during the previous talk we had some really good comments and sharing. So I'm encouraging you to continue to do the same. I also allow you to unmute yourself. If you do want to jump in, interrupt me. Feel free to ask a question, or if something's happening, let me know. Yeah, let's try to make this as somewhat interactive as possible, given our session here. So let me just jump in, and in a sense, I know this data is something you've seen many years, and the benefits of Agile are real. And so to help leaders understand this, to help organizations understand this, I think we need to be able to show this and say, hey, Agile's working. Agile's doing a lot of good things in the organization, but at the same time, the barriers, the challenges are just as real. And what's been interesting on the challenges slide here essentially is, while we think about the fact that culture for 13 years has been on the top of the list. This is the first year I thought that was interesting, that culture dropped from the top of the list. Usually it was over 50% indicated culture. So I'm hopeful this is actually, hey, there's some progress going on here. Yet we still have, I would say, 4 out of the 5 top barriers to Agile in large organizations deals with leadership, deals with the concept of an organization trying to be effective in change. And so yet, while culture maybe has bumped off the top of the list, I'm still seeing too many things on here that I think need to be addressed, and essentially some of the things we're going to be talking about in this session here. So the scaling disconnect I want to get into with you is the frameworks. The scaling frameworks have become, in a sense, a simple go-to, have become the thing that I think a lot of leaders have been jumping to. I think certainly a lot of coaches and trainers have been jumping to. There's been a lot of just it's easy to grab onto, but yet I don't think we're seeing the expected outcomes that I think a lot of organizations need to improve. And certainly, if we think about the past, 8 months with COVID, how has the organizational transformation enabled or hindered, or maybe made no difference to its response to COVID? So has COVID been a better transformation agent than your Agile system? Might be an interesting question to ask. And so let me share a little bit about what I'm seeing. And I'm going to pick on Scrum. And yes, I'm a Scrum member. I used to teach Scrum for, at least 10 years in teaching Scrum Masters and Product Owner. I'm an ex-certified Scrum trainer. I don't teach it anymore, primarily because of what we're going to be talking about here. But, take Jeff Sutherland, twice the work, half the time, and essentially you've got an explicit promise of a 4x productivity. And I know a lot of you may not subscribe to that, but essentially that is one of the promises that are laid out there. And so when you start thinking about Scrum at scale, What are they providing for those? And look at SAFE, some of the claims that are currently on their website. What they're saying here, we've got some pretty good numbers: 30 to 75% faster time to market, 10 to 50% increased employee engagement, 25 to 75% increase in productivity, wow, and a 20 to 50% increase in quality. And so you've got some pretty dramatic numbers there. And what I'm thinking of is I'm not going to suggest they're lying. I don't suggest they're not telling the truth. What I'm more wondering is how much of the truth are they sharing? And so the reality hasn't demonstrated these kind of numbers. And again, I'm not suggesting we can't find these numbers. I believe they're kind of on the right side of the bell curve. If we think about, for the most part, what is going on. All right, we need to mute everybody. Can I do that? All right, can somebody help me with that? Maybe, and I'll unmute myself, thank you. So the other thing that this study was finding, and by the way, this study was done in 2017. It was posted on InfoQ if you want to look at those particular results there. Scaled productivity is closer to about a 5% gain. So we are seeing some improvements. We are seeing some growth. We are seeing some effectiveness using scaling frameworks. We're not necessarily seeing the claims a lot of these scaling frameworks are putting in front of leaders. So what do we do with this as a coach? How do we rectify some of this, or how do we approach some of this? And so the disconnect I'm seeing, and this is a pattern I've seen for at least 10 to 15 years, is we introduce agility in an organization. What happens? If you've been coaching or working within organizations, you've seen this over and over again. The system starts to block this. What I mean by this is, your roles or responsibilities, your departments, your silos, your costs, everything that's going on here is essentially starting to impact the organization's ability to grow agility. So what happens in this mode? Well, essentially, you think about what's easier to change, the system or Agile. And of course, what ends up happening is Agile changes. What does Agile change to? That's the question. One of the things I see quite often is, in a sense, the concept that we just relabel Agile terms on the stuff we're doing today, and we just call it Agile. And I think you've seen some of those as well. So why is this happening? From my perspective, and this is something I've been looking at for many years, helping organizations become agile. Why is it struggling? What I see is this, what I call an outside-in approach. We come in and we approach Scrum and say, okay, well, let's try Scrum, or let's try SAFe, or let's do Scrum at scale or less, or whatever that might be in terms of introducing Agile in an organization. And certainly from a team perspective, we can get that to work. From a small department and in smaller organizations, some of this stuff works. But as we start to grow that, as we start to spread that out, broaden that, we hit the system. Now, what I want you to think about here is essentially that system. Think of that as a protection. Think of that as a vault that is protecting the most valuable assets of the organization. And inside those valuable assets aren't money, although that's another valuable asset it protects, is a set of values. And so what happens over time is the system is essentially building this protection mechanism to protect the culture of the organization. And this is why we often see culture raising to the top of the system or of the feedback of saying, hey, culture is getting in our way. And so the interesting phenomenon is this is occurring whether or not we go top down or bottom up. And I know you've seen this bottom up. We don't have leadership support. We don't get the system changed, but it's also happening top down. And what I see by this is a lot of leaders are delegating Agile to a committee, to a change group, and yet they're not taking the ownership responsibility. And they're the ones who are, in a sense, responsible for this system. Now, just to connect you to one other stat so we can kind of see the data laid out here. Essentially, what the Business Agility Institute looked at 440 organizations in 2018 and 2019. And by the way, you can go ahead and download their report. So they make those free, accessible reports. They highlight these organizations, and then they look at how effective they are. how effective at Agile, how effective are they at actually adapting? What is their fluency? And using some of the Agility Health Radar materials and tools to kind of measure this, the results aren't very very promising. What they're showing is basically, think of this as, a toddler learning to walk is a metaphor here. And the fluency of these, what we mean by that is how changeable, how malleable, how adaptable are these organizations. They're having struggles. So yes, while at one sense, Agile transformations are happening in fairly strong numbers, their impact is, again, not necessarily coming through. So here's my first pause. And in a sense, I'm probably speaking to the choir. And so I recognize that. And I also recognize that, this is something you probably like, duh, okay, Pete, don't tell us something we don't know. But here's what I'd like to hear from you is, how does your organization or an organization you worked with define success when they scale Agile? I'm just kind of curious if you want to throw a comment in. What does success mean? And if you feel free, you'd like to unmute yourself and share a question or comment here, I'm open to you doing that as well. So I'll just take a brief pause. Frequency of delivery coupled with rising customer NPS. I like that one, Jay. That was actually probably a decent one there. I'm enjoying the customer satisfaction. That's good. What I'm thankful for here is seeing some success is actually being customer oriented. What's interesting is a lot of organizations I've seen, hey, we define success by how many people have been taught Agile. We've defined success by how many Agile programs we have running. And so obviously what we're seeing is we measure success based on, how are we doing in terms of the broad spectrum of doing Agile. So delivering frequently, great. Time to market, awesome. Customer delight, good. So I'm glad we've got some good coaches here who are guiding at least scaling towards customer results. And so here's the second question for you. Oh, by the way, I saw one here, John, thanks. Number one for me, or number one, happy workers. So that's another interesting one, employee engagement there. So now a second question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how effective has your organization's Agile scaling been on actually improving this business outcome? So if you were to give it a guess and give it a number, 0 being on the low end, obviously, 10 being on the high end, I'd be kind of curious as to where are we at? We got some positive ones. Ashish, you've got a real strong 8 there. Good to see. We've got some positive. Al Brown, good. I like that. So we do have some positive successes here. Still in the early days, yeah. So, and again, what does success mean? How broad is this? It gets fairly complicated when we start thinking about, scaling and what's the impact of scaling. Jeff McKenna, I am sorry. Oh, you gave that to me personally. Okay. You gave me a personal number. I won't share that since it was personal. Sorry to hear that. 6, but going in the right direction. Thanks, Sean. Okay. So, I'm seeing results here that are actually maybe on, probably in the middle of the bell curve. So I'm seeing some positivity in this, and maybe that's because we've got some good coaches here, and we're having that positive impact. But I want to present now maybe a way to think about scaling that's different, and this is something that we're undertaking the Agile Leadership Journey as a different way to scale. And so the alternative scaling solution to us is a pretty simple premise, and likely you're already doing some of this with some of the organizations you work with, but why don't we just teach and coach leaders to create an engaged workforce imbued with true agency? And what I mean by that is this ownership and understanding that they need to actually shape this culture to be effective, to provide the workforce with the basic training and coaching for a growth mindset. So what we're doing at the Agile Leadership Journey is we're not teaching any Agile scaling methods. What we're teaching are the tools behind what does it mean to adapt. And what we're teaching is, what is the principles behind scaling? What are the principles behind scaling frameworks? And I think when you start to look and start to break down some of these things, what we're trying to do is provide, in a sense, a learning tool where, if you were to use the metaphor, scaling frameworks are giving people the fish. We're trying to help people learn how to fish and and catch fish, in a sense. And so what we're doing is developing leaders to be better agents of change in their organizations. And the reason I've come to this is, and the reason I don't teach Scrum anymore, and in fact, I do much less coaching of organizations, is what I find is that whether or not we come in and we teach Scrum or Scrum at Scale or SAFe or less, or whether we're a change agent, we come in and we help this organization be successful. What tends to happen is we build this dependency that all of a sudden, when we leave a vacuum. Rather than teaching the agency of the leadership, how do you do this, give you the responsibility, give you the ownership, you leave that agency behind. Now, what does this look like? How do we do this? In a sense, we're trying to change the adoption model. So rather than saying, let's start with Scrum, or let's start with SAFe, or let's start with Scrum at Scale, or less, what we're saying is, let's start with, who are we? What is it that makes our culture tick, and what has made us successful as an organization? Now, what I'm not suggesting here is we come in with a culture change. That's not actually what we're saying here. What we're saying is, let's align to culture. Let's understand our culture, because every organization we work with, whether it's insurance to banking to transportation to defense industries to government to education, they're all quite different in terms of their industry, in terms of their value systems. And you look at new companies, old companies, Swedish companies and Swiss companies, and they're all different. And so what we try to do is we try to align and say, okay, what makes us tick as an organization? What's our culture? What I want you to recognize, though, is as we go through this process and we start to build a skeleton for a more effective, adaptive organization, it doesn't require a major reorganization. We don't have to come in and say, we got to restructure all teams. Now, reorganization is certainly possible and certainly something we do all the time, but it's not a dictate, not a mandate in this case. What is a mandate is leadership education and awareness. What is a mandate is a leadership ownership, that they take the ownership of the organization. And what this becomes is quite personal. And this is what's unique about what we're trying to do here, is we're not teaching Agile to leaders. We're teaching leadership that enables Agile ways of working. And that's a very different mindset. And so what we're doing, and that's probably one of the biggest things people come out of our awareness workshops, is this isn't an Agile class. This was a leadership class. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is we're teaching leadership, because I think that's been left behind. And even our MBA programs, and think of all the other leadership programs, they haven't caught up with the Agile ways of working. And so in a sense, we're supplementing and we're complementing a lot of those other programs that have teach, basic communication and listening skills and stuff like that, but they're not teaching what's needed in an Agile organization. But there is an organizational dimension to this, and we'll touch on that as well. So what we're doing by turning this around, by going what we call inside out, not outside in, we've got to start with leadership. We've got to start with the understanding that leadership owns the system, and leadership is the one that's going to start to modify the system, both through their personal behaviors, how they think, how they act, also through then the lens of how do we change those policies? How do we change those structures? How do we change those measures? Because those are the tools, those are the gatekeepers of culture. And so if we want a quality system, well, we have policies and we have measures that keep our quality system. If we care about finances, certainly we have policies about budgets and sign-offs and approval processes to do those things. All of those things are created by leadership, but all of those things are built on a mindset. And so if you want to change the policy, the way you get at the policy, you've got to change the thinking. You've got to get into the mindset of these leaders. And so what we do is we start to adapt the system through adapting the leader. Now, I want to take just a brief side note here. Agile's not my goal. And I think we noticed that as I asked you, what is success for scaling Agile? I'm glad that most of you went to the fact that, hey, there's a business result involved. In fact, if a leader comes to me or comes to anybody in our program and says, hey, Pete, we want to be agile, my first question, why? What's our goal? Are we running from something? Are we failing something? Are we desiring something? What is it we need to do? Because that's our goal. Agile becomes the means to accomplish that goal. And it's people and culture that are going to be the key success factors. And if we can't impact the people and culture, we're going to fail in whatever transformation we undertake. And so my message back to the leaders is, if you don't start with leaders, you will fail. This will not be successful. And you've got to be direct. You've got to be, confrontational with leaders that, hey, if you don't take a stake in this, this is not something you delegate. This is something you own. We're going to have a problem. And so what I want to do is just touch in on this intersection between culture and leadership. And so recognize now, how do these two correlate? And I've got a book here. I probably should have put it in the slides. I didn't. I'll just kind of show it here. So many of you may have seen or heard this book. Edgar Sheen, basically he's got about a 400-page book here, The Organization, Culture, and Leadership. But if I were to boil it down to one phrase out of that 400-page book, it would be basically, or one image, it would be this. It's a coin. I've got a quarter here, US quarter. But what he says is basically that leadership and culture are two sides of the same coin. They're interrelated. You can't have one without the other. And in fact, when you think about a new organization, the new organization shapes culture. A leader comes into a brand new organization and entrepreneurial, you start shaping the culture because of your personality. Are you a free willing spirit? Well, you can have a free willing organization. Do you like to have a lot of rules? You're going to create a very heavy rule-based organization. And then over time, what happens, one of the best definitions I think I've heard of culture is the scars of our past failures. So you think about every scar, every problem an organization runs into. What do? We build the scar tissue. We build policies. We build rules. We build structures to prevent failures from going forward. And so you look at an organization 10, 20, 100 years later, and what do you see? You see that it's built up scar tissue on, hey, we're not going to do that again, or hey, this is what makes us successful. And what happens is now culture takes over. Culture shapes leaders. Leaders come in, and it's really tough to change that culture because it's so ingrained. But the only way to change culture is, again, through leadership. So these two are symbiotic. They're interrelated. There's no way we can separate these two. So what do? We've got to get access to our leaders. But the danger is assuming our senior leader is going to take this approach, assuming the CEO is going to take this. In fact, I would even argue that the CEO is probably the worst place to go. Now, if you get it, great. But if you don't have it, the risk up there is too high. They've got a far way to fall. They've got huge risks at a CEO layer. And, to be honest, I don't get access to too many CEOs, especially of large companies. I'd love to. I know like Ken and Jeff or something would say, hey, I don't engage an organization, let the CEOs on board, or, Craig Larman. But, that's very few of us, I think, in this room who can dictate that kind of, demand. I think most of us work somewhere else in the organization. Most of us here work in the middle. And then you ask, okay, can culture be shaped somewhere else? And my answer to you is yes. Every single person in an organization, every single person, not just the leaders, not just the VPs, not just the directors or senior directors, every single person shapes culture. And what I mean by that is in a sense, everybody has a set of values. Everybody is espousing a set of values. And in a sense, the culture is the collective way people work around an organization. So if you want to create a different culture, all you've got to do is start to change yourself, change you. And if you go back to I think it was the Gandhi quote, be the change you want to see in the world. That's what we're talking about here. So even you, no matter where you're at, whether you're a coach, a leader in an organization, can shape. And that's, in a sense, when we're teaching Agile leadership, we don't focus on the leader, we focus on the ship. Apologize, my microphone is going. And so what we're focused on here is essentially everybody has an influence in the organization of some level, and how you apply that influence is going to help shape the culture. So if you're looking to create, in a sense, an agile bubble or an agility bubble, or some what we call catalyst bubbles, those are possible. Now, a way you can see this, let's try to visualize culture, because I think culture is hard to see. So we think, culture is a set of values, a set of norms. There's lots of different definitions. It's what we do around here to be successful. I like to think of culture as a shadow. Now, what I mean by that is if you think about, hey, this is the way people act, and this is the physical body. Cultures, in a sense, like the reflection or the casting of the image of that of the organization or the people. So now we start to think, okay, if I want to change culture, how do I do that? Well, if you want to change a shadow, you have one of two choices. You either change the light source, which in many cases is really hard, or you just change you, move, change, shape, shift. So in a sense, what we're saying is you have the ability to shape culture just by how you change yourself. Now, to kind of reflect on this in a sense of thinking about, I can't do that much. Our culture's too big. It's been around too long. Yes, senior leaders cast very large shadows. So take an example of this. So take Microsoft. If you've seen anything of Microsoft over the past 20 some years, you've seen some leadership changes going on there, from Bill Gates to Steve Ballmer to Satya Nadella in the past 5-6 years now. And we've seen massive cultural shifts. I don't know if you've poked in on Microsoft, but when there was this shift from Bill Gates to Steve Ballmer, this was like one of these famous, leadership handoffs. He was the prince who was going to become, king, and there was all sorts of years of embellishment of this role change that was happening over time. And what was interesting in that is Steve Ballmer did a lot of really good things for Microsoft. He developed some of their cloud technologies and helped build, in a sense, some key tools, I would say, or strategies for Microsoft. Yet at the same time, Microsoft struggled tremendously compared to Apple, Google, Amazon, compared to their competitive landscape. Well, Microsoft was incredibly competitive. In fact, Steve Ballmer was a yeller, screamer, and rah, 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 let's go, let's fight. You go about all the way back to the days of Netscape, and we're going to beat Netscape. And they did, by the way, in those early days. They won a lot. We're going to fight Apple and beat Apple with, Windows and DOS, and they did. But that competition started to break down. They started to lose. And the strategy of Microsoft, while they might have had some effective strategies, and I think certainly they failed in others on, mobile and a few others, it broke down. And if you were to talk to somebody, I don't know if we have anybody here from Microsoft in our group here, the culture at Microsoft, from my external view and who I talked to, was highly challenging and dysfunctional. The competitive landscape, the infighting that was going on, the difficulty, challenges that were happening was incredibly tough. So in one sense, some of the strategies were maybe positive. In another sense, it was broken tremendously. And we've seen, and I encourage you to go read another book called Hit Refresh by Satya Nadella, and talking about the cultural shift that he has attempted to bring into Microsoft. And not only has he changed their corporate strategy from a competitive to a collaborative landscape, he's changed their internal culture in a way that is dramatically impacting Microsoft's ability to compete in the marketplace, to grow and be creative, and is having a huge impact. But this is a unicorn, right? This is a very unique situation that doesn't happen very often. And what's fascinating about Satya Nadella's story, his leadership is informed by his personal change. He has a child who is born with special needs. He was raised to be a firm, you do this as a parent, and yet as a parent himself couldn't do these things. And he becomes very vulnerable in talking about his personal story, about how he changed as a parent and how that changed his leadership approach. And what you're seeing is you're seeing that shadow reflected on Microsoft in a huge, effective way today. And so I encourage you to poke in on Microsoft, see what they're doing. It's translating to both cultural transformation and success. But you are not Satya Nadella, nor are you Steve Ballmer. If you're here, please chime in. I'd love to hear from you. You, on the other hand, are in the shadow of others. I'm guessing most of you have a smaller shadow. I have a smaller shadow than either of those two people. Some people might think I have a big shadow, but no, I've got a small shadow. But what's fascinating about small shadows are more intense. Small shadows are more compressed and more impactful. And what I mean by that is, let me take one example of Travis. And most of you probably don't know Travis. Travis is a middle manager. It was probably a first level manager and became a middle manager. And as he was involved in his journey in our programs, and we have both, awareness programs, practice programs, and the fortunate thing that we have is we get to work with leaders through kind of their journey, at least part of their journey. And Travis joined our program and was being successful and bringing Agile into as part of his organization, but yet struggling in many ways. And what was fascinating is as Travis was going through his journey and changing his leadership approach, we see the shadowing effect. Here is a card that Travis shared with us that was written as a card to him from a senior leader in his organization. It says, Travis. Stephen Covey once said, I am personally convinced that one person can be a change catalyst, a transformer in any situation, in any organization. And such an individual is yeast. That's an awesome word, yeast, that can leaven an entire loaf. It requires vision, initiative, patience, respect, persistence, courage, and faith to be a transforming leader. You have been a change catalyst for our organization. You had the vision for Agile work teams. You influenced the CEO and executive team. You executed the vision, transformed the way we work. As a result, our organization is more resilient to change and able to adapt to an increasingly dynamic world. I wish I could have written something that well. That is an awesome letter. And for Travis, that was an incredibly meaningful moment of influence about how his shadow not only impacted the truck teams he worked with, but his, as a change agent, has been able to cast a broader shadow and touch many others in the organization. And this is just one example of how, when you start to think about what does it mean to scale, isn't this really what we're looking for? Is scaling health, scaling resiliency, scaling co-creation, scaling transparency. You take any of our Agile values, wouldn't we rather scale those? But that happens in the way we work. So what do we have happening here? I think there's a disconnect. I think, in a sense, our scaling frameworks have gone to a simple solution. And in fact, I think they're actually, I believe, a little bit too far on the left-hand side of the Agile Manifesto. They're more about, right-hand side. They're more about process and tools than they are about individuals' interactions. And our alternative is to say, hey, let's scale mindsets. And this will enable whether you use the framework or not at all. And that's the other piece here. It's not an either or. It's not like, hey, we don't have to use a framework. I'm happy to use frameworks if there's a mindset there to support it. It's like frameworks are necessary, sufficient, but not necessary, sufficient, whatever that word is. It's not enough. We need more. So I'm going to pause here for another point of reflection and discussion. And there's been a lot of chat, and thank you. And I can't catch up with it all since I'm speaking. So I'm encouraging you to, I want to do this question first. On a scale of 0 to 10, how engaged have your, and I'm putting in quotes, senior leaders, meaning it might not be your CX level, it might just be in your organization, their senior leadership, so however you define your senior influential leaders, how engaged have they been in shaping your culture? see if these numbers match up with your other numbers. Oh, 11. Wow. That one flashed right by. Who was that? Martin Stahl. Martin, that's awesome. Brian Stallings, awesome. Good to hear. Teddy Carroll, Boulder, Colorado. Oh, you're right down my street, Teddy. I'm in just outside Boulder as well. Good to have you here. Well, this is good news. I'm seeing a lot of positive numbers. In fact, I'm seeing, just as a non-scientific results here, the first numbers came out pretty low. I had actually expected these numbers to be lower, but that's good to hear. But again, maybe I'm speaking to the choir. Maybe you're already engaging leadership in this way. So let me just pause here. Are there any questions or comments worth sharing that you'd be willing to unmute or just put in the chat?
Hi, Pete.
Yeah.
Andy here from Budapest.
Andy.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's great. It's really resonated with me. My main question is basically, so if you in every level, you can change the organization, sure, but the Agile is somehow very strong related with trust. And what if we have at the higher levels theory X managers and disturbing anything below a lower level that starts to going agile? How can we protect the small bubble or fruit that we try to nurture?
Yep.
Do you have any idea what is the best approach to avoid or even transform theory X managers,
yep,
helping them to understand what we try to achieve?
Yeah, and I appreciate that question, Nander. And in fact, the last block of and I'll jump into that here in just a second. The last block of what we teach is, we don't teach servant leadership. We don't teach, in a sense, even theory X, theory Y. What we teach is a tool called Catalyst Leadership. Comes from leadership agility. And one of the things we get in our workshop a lot is, I wish my manager were here. And everybody, and what's fascinating, I've even taught all the way up to the CX level, the C-suite we had in the room for one of our larger companies. It was a division in a very large bank. And the C-suite was there. So I'm like, okay, we're finally done with my leader needs to be here because we're all in the room. And sure enough, what did I get? The board needs to be here. So even senior, even C-suite has the pressure from above. So there's no escaping this mindset. And so our response to that is, you can create bubbles underneath you, but yes, it does require some trust, and it is harder. And one of the things we do teach as we look at this, and just to kind of share what we do here. So first of all, let me introduce this compass. We're teaching both the fact that if you want an agile organization, that's the bottom. You need agile leaders, that's the top. So the same reflection occurs. The organization's a reflection of leadership. And so what we do is we say, okay, we're going to teach agile leaders. You as leaders are going to enable the agility within the organization to drive the value delivery system. And hopefully what that does is starts to create better leaders inside that organization. Now you can do this at various levels. And so what we talk about with leaders is you have two kind of levers you can choose. One is what we call microculture. These are your thinking and behaviors, and everybody can impact what we call microculture. How you have a conversation, how do you make a decision, how do you run a meeting? All of these things are microculture, and we do these hundreds of times a day. Now the macro culture, and that's, the roles, policies, governments, those are harder. Those will require us working together to solve some of these problems because, like, for example, if we have a trust issue, there's likely a lot of policies that limit how much you can spend and approvals, and those are going to require some more leaders. We've got to create more leadership awareness to start to change those things. But in a sense, what we do is we give every leader a tool. And let me just jump past this slide here. We teach a tool called leadership agility, which is basically saying, okay, every leader has a mindset, a default mindset, and most leaders are what we teach are coming from what we call this expert mindset. I know what to do. I'm working on stuff. I'm smart. And what we teach is wait a second, we can move beyond this. and becoming an achiever leader, and fewer leaders kind of fall into this mode of achiever. What this means is I'm actually driving successful results. I'm meeting deadlines. I'm hitting budgets. I'm dealing with strategy, and I'm delivering new services. Achiever leaders are awesome leaders. And what we say is actually achiever leaders are more agile than experts, because when you move from one level to another in the way we teach, you don't get rid of the other level. What we're doing is we talk about this as being a layer. And so I've added a new, let's say, a new outfit that I can put on. But if I want, I can come back and I can be this expert. And so we start to relate to every leader. You, just by your growth, can start to become more agile in the way you think, the way you act, where you focus, your self-awareness. And we extend this and we start to move and say, okay, there's another layer here. Now, this third layer is what we really try to focus on with leaders. It's what we call the catalyst layer. And this is where we say, this isn't just servant leadership. This isn't just what do you need? How do you, support the organization? This is a change agent. This is an agitator. This is somebody in the organization who is in a sense, not just delivering results, but helping the organization in a sense grow. So the focal point becomes moving from what we do to who we are. The focal point moves from, delivering services to our customers to, creating a culture of engagement and co-creation. So we start to teach a number of dimensions to these leaders. And you know what? Every leader can, at any layer, can start to do these things on their own. And so one of the ways we get around this, we don't have trust or this, we give leaders tools that they can do themselves. Yeah. And so I realize I kind of get into a lot of stuff there. And so I'm going to pause and see, and just wanted to check in if there was any other questions we want to hit here. If somebody wants to unmute and ask one, that'd be great.
So this is Karen Zanetti. I'm wondering, what are those tools? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah. So let me do this. I didn't put one of our tools in this, but we teach conversational tools. We teach focus tools. We have a feedback tool. So we've got a whole set of tools, and we highlight those on our website if you want to look at that in the Agile Leadership Journey. Let me highlight one of kind of the organizational tools. By the way, this particular work is something that comes from the book called Leadership Agility, Bill Joyner, Stephen Josephs. One of the other tools that we do leverage is an awareness tool on culture. And this one comes from something called Competing Values Leadership out of the University of Michigan. What we find actually are some of the best tools are not agile tools. They're just, they're leadership tools, they're culture tools. Now, how do we use this? When we start to think about culture and whether Nandor was saying, hey, we have a trust problem, or what that represents to me is we have what's called in the competing values framework an over bias of control. And a lot of organizations, especially in safety, insurance, banking, transportation, government, safety is the number one concern. Health and doing things right the first time is the number one concern. Well, that's what makes you successful, yet that's also what prevents the ability for trust and freedom and autonomy and choice. And so what we're seeing here is yes, that's our current strength, but it also represents we have a weakness. And this isn't suggesting that every company is the same. In fact, when we look at companies, and if I were to pull out a company like Salesforce, and we did a lot of work with Salesforce was what we call an over-competitive company. So they weren't about being in control and safety. They were about go, 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 let's do this, this, this. But as they grew, they started to fall apart because it became too individual, too fast, and they weren't doing it together. And so their shift said, hey, we got to do this as a team. We got to do this together. We got to be in sync. What we recognize, what we help leaders do is recognize Agile isn't a particular value set. Agile isn't saying, hey, be more control, be more create, be more collaborate. In fact, what we learn is Agile means all these things. And Agile means our ability to adapt. Because every organization, in fact, every leader has bias. If I were to go back into the concept of leadership, my bias, I have a very strong achiever bias. It takes me work and adaptability to act like a catalyst. And that's something I work with every day. Every organization has a bias. And what we teach leaders to do is to recognize, okay, what's our bias? Why is that there? If we want to be more effective, we've got to get more balance. Okay, what can we do to achieve more autonomy, more creativity, if that's truly going to help us be more successful without necessarily giving up safety? How do we create safe experiments? So what we do is we work with leaders to help both themselves in terms of who am I, how do I fit in this framework, but also our organization, what is our culture, how do we shift in that setting? So that just gives you maybe just another kind of tool that we bring to the table. So rather than thinking about scaling a framework, we're talking about scaling your mindset, scaling the value system in what you're doing. We've got about 4 minutes left here, just to kind of touch on just a couple of things we do in the Agile leadership journey. Is we provide, in a sense, these awareness workshops. So these are either in person or online, depending on COVID. We try to keep things really small, intimate learning sessions. But then we have practice programs where we actually take leaders, and this is where someone like Travis fits in. We take them through a journey, at least a 6-month journey of growth in their own personal development or working with their organization through some growth. And so we're basically building a scaling organization here to inspire and catalyze leaders to improve rather than just scale frameworks. And so we've got a global guide community. If this is something you'd be interested in as a guide, we are seeking, to find additional people to be able to focus in this way. And so I encourage you to think about that in your personal journey as a coach. So again, I'm going to pause here. Any particular ahas or questions that you have? We have a couple of minutes left.
This is Hari Hirani from Federal Reserve Bank.
Thank you.
I have a question. When you have people having smaller shadows start on a journey, they are essentially out of step quickly with the rest of the culture of the organization. How does that work out, or is that for a short period of time a career-ending opportunity for them?
I mean, there are situations. Yeah, there are situations where leaders have decided, it's an environment I can't operate in. And in those cases, it's sad, but necessary to maybe move on, where you cannot impact the culture. In most cases, you're right. What I suggest is build a contract with your manager. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to operate different. I'm going to need a little bit of trust here, but I'm also got to be able to demonstrate. So as a leader, you're not, you can't avoid demonstrating results. Travis was able to demonstrate results and do something different. So that's what we really talk about here is, yes, hopefully it's I'm going to align with the culture and then push it a little bit. And that's an art, not a science. How much can I push without being, too much of a negative catalyst? Yeah, thanks. Is there someone else that'd like to unmute and ask?
So Pete, in the same vein of that discussion, part of the success of a catalyst, is it developing sponsorship and agency as well? So you're not trying to go it alone.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's why, when you can do this together, and we do a lot of, most of the work we do is actually private, not public. You have a whole leadership team or send 5 people to a public class. What I always tell leaders is if you cannot be alone, that's better. If you can come in with a group that you can speak in one voice, that's always better. So yes, I appreciate that, Terry. One last question. Actually, we're probably out of time, just a few seconds left here. So I want to just thank you again for joining. Thanks for the Scrum Alliance. These slides will be made available, and feel free to reach out. Take a look at what we're doing, encourage you to learn a little bit more about this and join our mission to scale mindsets over practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. This was definitely a great session. I agree with the clapping that is going on in the audience. everyone shapes the culture, and it starts with all of us here today. So let's be the change we want to see in the world, starting with each and every one of us. And I see a change champion in all of us here. So thank you for that, Pete.
You're welcome. Yep. Thanks for having me. And everybody have a great day if I don't see you later today.